November 1945, Frankfurt, Germany. Two men sat across from each other in a requisitioned German mansion. Outside, American soldiers were going home. Inside, a 30-year friendship was ending. Neither man knew it yet. One would be dead in 5 weeks. The other would spend the rest of his life wondering if he could have said something different. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had summoned George Patton to his headquarters. The war had been over for 6 months. Patton was causing problems. Eisenhower needed to have a conversation he'd been avoiding for weeks. What neither man understood as they began talking that November afternoon was that this would be their last face-to-face meeting. Everything that needed to be said between them would either be said in this room or never said at all. When the meeting ended, both men walked out believing they would see each other again. They were wrong. The last time Eisenhower saw Patton alive, neither man knew it was goodbye. What they said, and what they didn't say, would haunt Eisenhower for 24 years. Subscribe for more stories like this. 30 years before they knew. Eisenhower and Patton first met in 1919 at Camp Meade, Maryland. Both were young officers assigned to the Tank Corps. Both believed armor would revolutionize warfare. They became friends immediately. For the next 2 decades, their careers paralleled. Peacetime Army assignments, staff colleges, promotions that came slowly, frustration at being stuck in an army that didn't value innovation. Patton had family wealth. Eisenhower had political skill. Both had ambition that exceeded their rank. In 1940, when war came to Europe, both men were still lieutenant colonels. By 1942, Eisenhower was a general commanding Allied forces in North Africa. Patton was his field commander. The friendship shifted. One man gave orders, the other man obeyed them. Usually. The slapping incidents in Sicily, 1943, nearly destroyed both careers. Patton slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. The press found out. Congressmen demanded he be fired. Eisenhower faced the hardest decision of their friendship: fire his best tactical commander, or protect a man who had violated basic decency. Eisenhower chose protection. He reprimanded Patton severely, but kept him in command. Patton never forgot that Eisenhower had saved his career. Eisenhower never forgot that Patton had forced him to make that choice. From 1943 to 1945, the pattern held. Patton won battles. Eisenhower managed the political consequences. Patton said things that created diplomatic disasters. Eisenhower cleaned them up. The friendship survived because the war required both of them. But survival isn't the same as trust. May 1945. The war ends. The problems begin. Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945. For 3 years, the alliance against Hitler had given Eisenhower and Patton a shared purpose. Now, that purpose was gone. What remained was occupation duty, denazification policy, and political management. Patton was terrible at all 3. By summer 1945, Patton was making statements that horrified Washington. He wanted to attack the Soviet Union immediately. He called denazification policy idiotic. He said the Nazi Party was no different from Republicans and Democrats. He was creating diplomatic incidents weekly. Eisenhower was receiving pressure from Marshall, from Truman, from the press. Remove Patton from command. Send him home. Get him away from reporters. The man who had won battles across France and into Germany was now a political liability. Eisenhower resisted. He moved Patton from 3rd Army to 15th Army, a paper command with no operational responsibilities, a demotion disguised as a lateral transfer. Patton understood what it meant. September 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton from even this reduced command. The official reason was Patton's denazification comments. The real reason was that Eisenhower couldn't protect him anymore. The political cost was too high. For the second time, Eisenhower had to choose between Patton and everything else. This time, he chose differently. Patton took the relief badly. His staff reported he was depressed, drinking more, talking about retirement. The warrior who had driven across Europe was stuck in Germany, with nothing to command and no war to fight. Eisenhower knew Patton was struggling. He also knew there was nothing he could do about it. The decision was made. November 1945. The summons. Eisenhower sent word to Patton. "Come to Frankfurt. We need to talk." Patton made the drive from Bavaria. He knew what the meeting would be about. Eisenhower was going to tell him to go home. The war was over. His usefulness was over. Time to leave. What Eisenhower didn't know was that Patton was planning to resign anyway. He was tired. He was frustrated. He was 60 years old and had nothing left to prove. The Army didn't want him. Washington didn't want him. Maybe it was time to write his memoirs and retire to California. But he hadn't told Eisenhower this yet. He wanted to hear what his old friend would say first. The meeting took place in Eisenhower's office. Both men were in uniform, professional, formal, not like the old days at Camp Meade, when they would argue about tank tactics over drinks. This was Supreme Commander and Subordinate General. The friendship was still there, buried under 30 years of history and 6 months of political disaster. But it was there. Eisenhower spoke first. The conversation that followed would haunt him for the rest of his life. The conversation neither man wanted. Eisenhower told Patton he needed to return to the United States. There was no role for him in occupied Germany. His statements about the Soviets were creating problems. His denazification comments had damaged his credibility. It was time to go home. Patton listened without interrupting. When Eisenhower finished, Patton asked one question. Was this a suggestion or an order? Eisenhower said it was a strong suggestion. Patton said he understood. Then Patton said something Eisenhower wasn't expecting. He agreed. He was ready to go home. He was tired of occupation duty. He was tired of politics. He wanted to retire and write. For once, they were in agreement. The meeting could have ended there, but Patton kept talking. According to later recollections, Patton told Eisenhower that the Soviet Union was the real enemy, that defeating Hitler only to let Stalin dominate Eastern Europe was a strategic disaster, that American forces should push the Soviets back while they still could, that waiting would make confrontation inevitable and more costly. He made the same arguments he'd been making for months, the arguments that had gotten him relieved from command. Eisenhower had heard this before. He responded the same way he always did. The decision wasn't military, it was political. Truman and Churchill had made agreements with Stalin. The alliance with the Soviet Union was policy. Eisenhower's job was to implement policy, not challenge it. Patton's job was the same. Patton said that was exactly the problem. Good soldiers followed orders even when the orders were wrong. Eisenhower said that's what being a soldier meant. Patton said maybe he'd been a soldier long enough. The conversation was going in circles. Both men had said these things to each other before. Nothing was going to change. Eisenhower was going to implement policy. Patton was going to go home. That should have been the end of it. But then, according to accounts from those who knew both men, Patton said something that stuck with Eisenhower. Something about winning the war but losing the peace. Eisenhower didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew Patton was right. They also both knew it didn't matter. The decision was made. What wasn't said. There were things both men could have said that afternoon that remained unspoken. Eisenhower could have thanked Patton for 30 years of friendship, for the victories in Sicily and France, for being the tactical genius that Eisenhower's strategy relied on, for making Eisenhower's reputation possible. He didn't say any of that. Patton could have thanked Eisenhower for protecting him after the slapping incidents, for giving him Third Army when no one else would, for managing the political disasters that Patton's mouth created, for being the friend who always pulled him back from the edge. He didn't say any of that either. They were professional. They were formal. They discussed Patton's travel arrangements back to the United States. December would be good. That would give Patton time to close out his affairs in Germany. Eisenhower agreed. December worked. The meeting ended. Both men stood. They shook hands. Eisenhower said they'd see each other back in the States. Patton said he'd look forward to it. Both men believed this was true. It wasn't. December 9th, 1945. 3 weeks later. Patton was driving near Mannheim, Germany. His staff car was hit by an army truck. Patton was thrown forward, breaking his neck. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down. He was transported to a hospital in Heidelberg. The doctors said the injury was catastrophic. He might live for weeks. He would never walk again. Eisenhower received word of the accident immediately. He was in Frankfurt, less than 100 kilometers from Heidelberg. He could have visited. Patton's wife Beatrice was flying in from the United States. She would arrive in 2 days. Eisenhower sent his chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, to check on Patton and report back. He did not visit personally. For 12 days, Patton lay in the hospital, paralyzed, waiting to die. He was conscious most of this time. He could speak. He could receive visitors. He knew he was dying. He asked for his wife. He asked for his staff. Accounts vary on whether he asked for Eisenhower. What's not in dispute is that Eisenhower never came. December 21st, 1945. Patton died. Pulmonary edema, heart failure, the complications of paralysis. He was 60 years old. He died with his wife beside him. Eisenhower was not there. What Eisenhower learned later. After Patton's death, Eisenhower learned things about that final meeting that changed how he understood it. Patton's staff told him that Patton had been planning to announce his retirement in December. He was going to go home and write his memoirs. He was done fighting. The conversation in Frankfurt had been Patton's goodbye to military service, even if he hadn't said it explicitly. Eisenhower also learned that Patton had told his staff the meeting with Eisenhower had been difficult but necessary, that he and Ike had said what needed to be said, that their friendship would survive this, like it had survived everything else. Patton believed that. He died believing that. Eisenhower spent the rest of his life thinking about that November afternoon in Frankfurt. He would tell people it was the last time he saw Patton alive. He would say they had discussed Patton's return to the United States. He would not talk about what else was said. He would not talk about what wasn't said. In 1948, when Eisenhower wrote his memoir, Crusade in Europe, he devoted several pages to Patton's military genius. He described him as one of the most brilliant tactical commanders in American military history. He talked about the victories in Sicily and France. He mentioned the slapping incidents and his decision to keep Patton in command. He did not mention their last meeting. He did not mention that he never visited Patton's hospital bed. The words that were never spoken. The tragedy of that final meeting wasn't what was said. It was what both men believed they would have time to say later. Eisenhower thought he would see Patton again in the United States. They would have dinner. They would talk about the war without the pressure of command. They would remember Camp Meade and the early days when they were just two young officers who believed in tanks. There would be time for all of that. Patton thought the same thing. He was going home. He would write his memoirs. He would see Eisenhower in Washington or at some military function. They would shake hands and remember that whatever disagreements they had about the Soviets, or denazification, or politics, they had 30 years of friendship that mattered more. There would be time to repair whatever had been damaged. There would be time to say the things that professional soldiers don't say to each other while they're still in uniform. Both men were wrong. There was no more time. The last words they spoke to each other in that Frankfurt office in November 1945 were the final words of a friendship that had lasted 3 decades. And those words were about travel arrangements and policy disagreements, and when Patton would leave Germany. Nothing that mattered. Nothing that would have made the ending different. What the meeting revealed. That final meeting revealed something about both men that neither probably wanted to acknowledge. They had grown apart. Not because of personality or politics or the Soviet question. They had grown apart because their roles had changed their friendship into something that no longer fit who they were. Eisenhower had become a political general. His genius was coalition management, diplomatic balancing, strategic patience. He was going to be Army Chief of Staff, probably president someday. He had learned to compromise, to manage competing interests, to see multiple perspectives. These were strengths. But they made friendship with Patton difficult. Patton had no interest in compromise or multiple perspectives. Patton believed in winning. Patton had remained a warrior. His genius was tactical aggression, operational speed, instinctive battlefield decision-making. He was never going to be chief of staff or president. He was going to be remembered for driving across France in 1944, for relieving Bastogne in 1945, for being the general German commanders feared most. He had never learned to compromise. These qualities made him a brilliant combat commander, but they made him impossible to manage in peacetime. The friendship couldn't survive what they had become. The war had made that clear, but neither man wanted to acknowledge it. So they had one final meeting where they talked about logistics and policy, and pretended that this was just another temporary difficulty in a friendship that had survived everything else. It wasn't. It was goodbye. They just didn't know it yet. Patton was buried at Luxembourg American Cemetery alongside soldiers of Third Army. He had requested to be buried among his men. Eisenhower did not attend the funeral. He was in Washington. He sent representatives. He issued a statement praising Patton's military genius, but he was not there when his old friend was laid to rest. For the rest of his life, Eisenhower would be asked about Patton. He would always say that Patton was one of the greatest combat commanders in American history. He would say their friendship had been one of the most important relationships of his life. He would say he missed his old friend. All of this was true. What he wouldn't say was that he regretted that final meeting in Frankfurt, that he wished he had said something different, that he wished he had visited the hospital, that he wished he had one more chance to talk to Patton without the weight of command and politics and 30 years of complicated history between them. He kept these regrets private. The last time Eisenhower saw Patton alive was November 1945 in Frankfurt. They discussed policy and logistics and travel plans. They shook hands. They believed they would see each other again. 3 weeks later, Patton was paralyzed in a car accident. 12 days after that, he was dead. Eisenhower never visited the hospital. He never attended the funeral. The friendship that had lasted 30 years ended in a requisitioned German office with a handshake and a promise to meet again in the States. A promise that would never be kept. Neither man knew it was goodbye. That's what made it devastating. Eisenhower became president and led the free world. But he never stopped thinking about that afternoon in Frankfurt and the hospital visit he never made. Subscribe for more untold stories.